Thank you to the Press Club for giving this opportunity to give my second speech in less than a year here at the Press Club. And thank you to the many colleagues in attendance here today. My federal colleagues, Paul Fletcher, Dean Smith, Michaelia Cash, Bridget McKenzie and Holly Hughes, and my former federal colleagues, former Speaker Tony Smith, great to see Tony here, Zed Zelja, and then the many ACT colleagues who are here as well, Jeremy Hanson, Leanne Castley, Mark Parton, Peter Kane and Ed Cox. It's great to have you all here today. I want to start by asking a question, a very simple question. Do you feel better off than a year ago? I ask this question of many Australians and I get a very consistent answer. Inflation hurts all Australians. The impact of inflation is not limited to a few. I witnessed this firsthand growing up in the tiny village of Nimidabel, a couple of hours south of here, in the 1970s and the 1980s. In many ways, this was the reason I first became interested in economics. We were living inflation every single day. I saw neighbours, good family investments, good family businesses who had made investments, growing their business, borrowed money, only to see inflation and high interest rates devastate their plans. Persistent inflationary pressure is the new crisis for this government. Bringing down cost of living pressures and delivering long-term economic growth is hard government, requiring hard choices just like those that the Coalition made during the pandemic. Now, we all remember the challenge before us in March 2020, and we probably would prefer to forget, is the reality, but a crisis that required difficult decisions, required governments of all persuasions to challenge their instincts, was in front of us at that time. It required policymakers to respond to the demands at the time and do so quickly, without the luxury of time. And that's exactly what we did. And because of these policies, Australia achieved a remarkable V-shaped recovery and emerged from the pandemic in a better position than most or all countries we benchmark ourselves against. Record low unemployment, record number of apprentices in training, and a budget that from the moment the East Coast states reopened was in surplus. From the moment the East Coast states opened up. From November 2021, when Victoria and New South Wales left lockdown, to today, the Department of Finance has published 17 months of financial accounts. The monthly figures show that from the moment the East Coast emerged from lockdown and travel restrictions began to ease, the government experienced a net underlying cash balance surplus of $33 billion. That's going back to November 2021. As respected economist Chris Richardson has pointed out, the net debt to GDP has returned to where it was prior to the pandemic. But just as the pandemic crisis required constant adaptation and response, so too does the current environment. With inflation raging across our economy, this is the crisis government has to deal with now. Hard-working families are climbing a mountain day in, day out to pay the bills and to support their children. A typical family paying off their home is $25,000 a year worse off than they were a year ago. Hit hard by higher mortgage costs, taxes, energy bills and other rising costs of living. Families like Nicole and Dougie from Goulburn, my hometown, raising 2 children in a home they recently bought. They're paying an additional $890 a month on their mortgage. And while their increases are less than many, Nicole is facing the possibility she might have to go back to work earlier than she had thought or wanted after a second child, just to help make ends meet. Then there's Corey and Sarah, young parents working hard to pay off their home in Perth. They're everyday victims of inflation, struggling under the pain of rising interest rates, higher grocery bills and skyrocketing energy bills. Corey said, what this budget has said to all Australians is the government hasn't listened to any of us. The government hasn't listened to any of us. There is no help for us in this budget. Small business owners Brianna and Alex are feeling the pinch of rising expenses due to high inflation. The parents of two have had to pull back on their hiring of extra staff and cut back on their own spending. Now, these are just a few examples of working couples faced with difficult decisions so they can keep paying their bills and putting food on the table. The choices are stark. Do they pull their children out of sport or cancel the family holiday? Does Dad take on a second job or weekend work? Or does Mum go back to full-time work while the kids are still babies? Lifeline reports that 80% of its calls now, 80% of its calls relate to cost of living. Deloitte Access Economics estimates that approximately 300,000 Australians are living in negative cash flow. High inflation means that hard-working Australians who want to get ahead are only going backwards. It risks the creation of a new generation of working poor. Now, there's a deep conflict between our current economic context and the economic orthodoxy many have supported in recent times, particularly during the pandemic. We've become accustomed to hearing, particularly from our political opponents, that more government and more spending is the solution to all economic challenges. But inflation economics is fundamentally different. Fundamentally different. Big government makes the situation worse. American economist Eric Leeper has documented the many mistakes that governments made through the 60s, 70s and 80s that led to inflation getting out of control and remaining untamed. The mistakes can be characterised very simply. Governments responding by treating the symptoms, not the source of inflation. Treating the symptoms, not the source. This budget makes that very mistake. It gives with one hand while taking away with the other with higher prices and higher taxes. It means the Reserve Bank is slamming the brakes at the same time as the government has the foot on the accelerator, and when you do that, you wreck the engine. A year into this government, Australia has one of the highest core inflations levels amongst major economies. At 6.6%, our core inflation is higher than the UK at 6.2%, the US 5.6%, Canada 4.3%, Euro area at 5.7%. Headline inflation remains stubbornly high, particularly in our services sector. The RBA's latest monetary policy decision should have rung out like an alarm bell through the government about the urgency of the challenge. It was truly a wake-up call. Australians are making, as I said, hard choices every day, yet they are not seeing a government with the willingness to do the same. Inflation now is coming from Canberra, not the Kremlin, and it's Canberra's problem to solve. Inflation will be stronger for longer if governments deny the problem and adopt the wrong solutions. And while many argue that the principles that have driven coalition economic policy have become less relevant in the recent past, the values that drive us give us the right toolkit for the time. The right toolkit for the time. We believe that private business drives opportunity and prosperity, not big government. We believe that fiscal discipline is necessary to take pressure off prices. Lower taxes, balanced budgets, spending growth restraint are all essential. We believe that productivity reforms are the key to making life easier, removing supply-side constraints and setting up the economy for medium to longer-term growth. And we believe in backing hard-working, aspirational Australians to get ahead, to lift all Australians together. This is the pathway back to a low-inflation, high-growth economy. But by focusing on the system, the symptoms, the budget divides Australia into the worthy few and the forgotten. The forgotten including small businesses, middle-income families, mortgage holders, farmers, truckies, regional communities and many others. Less inflation is good for all Australians, not just a few, for every single one of us. And rather than dividing the country, lower inflation brings the country together, giving all Australians a pathway to prosperity, giving every Australian the opportunity to fulfil their goals. And that is exactly what Peter Dutton outlined in his budget reply speech. Peter has clearly laid out that there are differences in the approach we would take. There are also places where we can find common ground with the government. We've again reiterated our support for ensuring that the NDIS is sustainable. As we did with the RBA review, I think very well this is something we're prepared to work with the government on in a collaborative way. The NDIS is too important. Securing its future should be above all politics. Now, well ahead of this budget, we were clear on the need for fiscal constraint and other sensible measures to take pressure off Australian households and businesses. It was a simple test for any party that seeks to claim it can manage the economy. Instead, we saw the opposite. We saw $185 billion of new spending since Labor came to office. $185 billion of new spending in the last year. $2 of new spending initiatives for every dollar of revenue initiatives. It's 2 to 1. Poorly planned migration that the Treasurer's own budget papers say will drive up housing costs in the budget papers. A fiscal strategy that removed fighting inflation from what was already called, I quote, the weakest fiscal strategy in living memory, quoting there the economist Stephen Hamilton. A failure to heed the calls of major business groups and economists to restore the fiscal guardrails that had been in the fiscal strategy since 1996, including a commitment to budget balance. And as has been pointed out by the Australian Financial Review's John Keogh, this budget even walks away from the Treasurer's one fiscal rule in the last budget. Far from returning 99% of the revenue windfalls to the bottom line, as promised in October, the government has banked just 40% of improvements in the bottom line since PFO and spent 60% or more of the massive windfall from strong commodities and job markets. Now, no one wins from a big spending government in an inflation crisis. At best, the budget fails to address inflation. At worst, it adds fuel to the fire. There is a credible case that it is actually making things worse. Rich Insights Director Chris Richardson said he, and I quote, had thought that the Reserve Bank was done and dusted, but this has notably raised the chance they will do another swing of the baseball bat. S&P Global Ratings disputed the government's forecast, stating we expect inflation to be stubbornly higher than the Reserve Bank's target until fiscal 2026, and that handouts in today's budget may add to inflationary pressures. And BetaShares Chief Economist David Bassis calls the budget unambiguously expansionary. Now, it's concerning to see the Treasurer, who spent more time spinning budgets than studying them, dismissing the views of economists so easily. Meanwhile, the government seems to have spent the last week trying to work out who this budget is supposed to help, rather than being focused on who it was supposed to help from the start. Middle Australia was not spoken of in the lead up to the budget or in the Treasurer's budget speech. And yet, in the post-budget wash-up, the Treasurer mentioned Middle Australia 41 times. The Prime Minister, 15 times in his media appearances and counting. I'm sure we'll hear many more. Labor can try to spin its way out of a budget failure, but it won't change the fact that there is no light at the end of the tunnel for hard-working Australians who are trying to get ahead. Given the strength of commodity prices, the jobs market, the trend of monthly surpluses I've described coming out of the pandemic, it's been clear that a drover's dog could have delivered a surplus this year. It's essential the government do the same next year, and it's also within reach to deliver ongoing budget balance. This is the true test for Labor. It's not easy, but it can be done, and we know this because we did it. Prior to the pandemic, the Coalition in 2019 balanced the budget, and then we did this while increasing spending on essential services, growing defence spending to over 2% of GDP, and supporting the creation of more than 1 million jobs and 250,000 businesses. And the key to it was we got the economy to grow faster than our spending. Now, the path to fiscal consolidation is not to tax Australians more. Labor's fiscal strategy sets no cap on tax growth and contains no commitment to private sector-led growth. This is the wrong strategy. Higher taxes stifle investment, innovation and aspiration. As economist Alberto Alesina has shown us, tax-driven fiscal improvements damage growth compared with containment of spending growth. Simply put, you cannot tax your way into economic prosperity, just as you can't spend your way out of high inflation. Australians struggling with the cost of living will see taxes rise on top of ever-increasing prices. But worse, some of these taxes are bound to be passed right onto consumers' bills. The truckies tax adding to the cost of food and freight. $153 million tax on our farmers. Labor's franking credits and super taxes will be directly felt by self-funded retirees and pensioners alike. And bracket creep, the tax you don't notice until you look at the impact on your bank account, is eating away at Australians' earning power. The budget papers show income tax as a percent of GDP growing over the forwards. And over the next 5 years, the tax paid by Australians will increase by more than $300 billion. $300 billion. Now, this budget has abandoned tax incentives that support innovation, investment and productivity that grow the economy. The patent box regime has been abandoned. The technology investment boost has not been extended. And whilst we welcome the retention of the instant asset write-off, the government has decimated its asset value cap and removed access to the investment allowance for medium-sized businesses. Labor's big spending, high taxing, high regulation agenda risks putting us into a period of stagflation. Inflation and low economic growth are a very dangerous combination, a very dangerous cocktail. And it's why the government's committed to, or the coalition is committed to, restoring the same fiscal rules that delivered lower taxes and a balanced budget in 2019. It's why the coalition is committed to restoring the tax to GDP cap. It's why we're committed to delivering the stage 3 tax cuts. And it's why we continue to fight Labor's broken promises on taxes to superannuation and franking credits. Now, strong economic growth over the short term and into the longer term is essential to boosting quality of life. And at a time where inflation is making quality of life, standard of living worse, productivity gains are the only pathway to ensure Australians can realise their aspirations over the medium to long term, making it easier to do a job or run a business, making it easier for customers to get a better deal or engage with government services. The McKinsey Global Institute has highlighted that productivity reform is essential to solving the challenges confronting most advanced economies, ranging from labour market shortages, debt, inflation and energy challenges. The Reserve Bank minutes from April have sounded the alarm bell on productivity, but the government isn't listening. The government talks a lot about productivity to justify billions of dollars of extra expenditure, yet its own budget shows a deteriorating productivity position despite the spending. The Productivity Commission's 5-year review has all but been buried, with not a single measure in budget paper number 2, a direct response to the recommendations made, not a single measure responding to those recommendations. Worse, the budget throws up challenges to productivity and economic growth, particularly when it comes to people and energy. Now, the budget has the Australian population growing by substantially more than Adelaide over the next 5 years, but with no plan to address housing supply, infrastructure needs and other services required to make that growth successful. We all support a well-planned migration program, and that's the history of coalition governments. But over 5 years, net overseas migration will see our population increase by over 1.5 million people. It's the biggest migration surge in our country's history, and it's occurring amidst a housing and rental crisis. Migration is an enormous part of our history and has been critical to our economic success, our culture, our lifestyles and who we are. I saw the enormous power of aspirational migrants as a kid growing up near Cooma, south of here, one of the proudest migrant communities in Australia. More than 100,000 people from over 30 countries travelled to the Snowies after the Second World War for work on the Snowy scheme. So whilst migration will continue to serve us well into the future, it only works if you have a complementary plan around the infrastructure, the housing and the services that are required. Instead, the government is cutting infrastructure spending in real terms and reallocating it to their pet projects. Now, if you talk to any business, big or small, around Australia right now, they'll tell you that one of their biggest supply constraints remains labour shortages. We have record job vacancies of over 435,000 people. Alongside managed migration, there is an opportunity to give more Australians the incentive to get into work or increase the hours of work they're doing. A high proportion of the 550,000 unemployed Australians are capable of working more than 30 hours a week. And there is nothing like a job to improve somebody's life. Australians on JobSeeker face effective marginal tax rates of up to 60 cents in the dollar. This is a huge disincentive to work at a time when the economy and job seekers can't afford it. It's why Peter Dutton announced our proposal to increase the amount a job seeker could earn before their payment is affected. This is a common sense policy that could boost the income of someone on JobSeeker that works not by $40 a fortnight, but by up to $300. It's similar to the pension work bonus we championed, and the government ended up implementing a version of it at least, not the full version, but a version last year. We've suggested this is a bipartisan, constructive way because we think this is ultimately better for those on JobSeeker, but also for the country, because it will help to put downward pressure on inflation. Another major barrier to growth is energy prices going in the wrong direction, alongside Labor's attacks on the gas sector, a sector we need to support lower emissions and lower energy prices. Between the gas caps, the PRRT, the safeguard mechanism, delayed approvals and the abandoning of carbon capture and storage incentives, one of our largest export industries is under attack from the government. It's a death by 1,000 cuts to an industry that has powered our nation and our economy for so many years. It is one of Australia's great success stories, and just as Australia needs it to be successful, so too do so many of our customer countries throughout Asia. Meanwhile, most hard-working Australians will not benefit a cent from the government's cost of living relief, despite because of power bills increasing by more than $500 for a typical household. A more prosperous Australia demands a sharp focus on a low inflation and high growth economy. And in Peter Dutton's budget reply, he made several down payments on an agenda that will promote growth in the medium term, supporting gas as a medium-term energy source and removing barriers to nuclear energy, restoring mental health sessions to Medicare so Australians can be healthier at a time of crisis that we're seeing for so many, committing to a tax to GDP cap that will incentivise productivity in government, and repealing Labor's super tax. The starting point for real action on growth and productivity is to take action to support businesses to lower costs and keep strong employment right across our economy. Now, $1 today is worth less than it was a year ago. $1 today is worth less than it was a year ago. And this government's policies risk inflation and interest rates that are higher for longer, prolonging the pain. Australians trying to get ahead will be the ones who pay the biggest price. The Coalition has been clear that we would not have delivered this budget. Our priority would be to bring down inflation and set up Australia for growth in the medium term through lower taxes and growth-enhancing policies. This would take pressure off prices and prevent a generation of Australians becoming the working poor. It would support the Reserve Bank by having a fiscal policy pulling in the same direction as monetary policy, and it would set up Australians for the future they deserve. Thank you very much.